Well, one of the things that, like I shared last week with you, is we were doing kind of staff evaluations at the end of the year, and one of the things that kept coming up was the need that we all have to rest better. I think there wasn't a single person that didn't fill something out that said something about Sabbath, or on the little I think it's a Likert scale when you rank yourself from like 1 to 5 or whatever. All of those were low. And so one of the things that we want to do over these next few months in our staff chapels is focus on Sabbath. So as we're looking at staff in our staff lunch, thinking about goal setting, productivity, and execution, at the same time as we're wanting to be productive and those kinds of things, we also want to think about how we can rest well, because it's something that we're probably, just to be honest, we're always going to struggle with. It's always going to be a challenge. We're always going to be pushed to want to do more, need to do more, feel like we should do more. And so over the next 3 months, we're going to be looking at Sabbathing. Today, we're going to be talking about stopping and resting. In February, Sean is going to be sharing with us about delighting in your Sabbath. And then in March, Matthew Weaver is going to be sharing with us about contemplating in your Sabbath. And so here's what I want you to, this is just the very basic thing to think about today as we kind of look at some of the scriptures. To truly Sabbath, we first have to stop and rest. To truly Sabbath, we first have to stop and rest. I know that's not rocket science, right? But it's a reminder for all of us that if we genuinely want to Sabbath, we have to stop and rest. And we're going to talk about in a little bit also the difference between what it means to Sabbath versus what it means to just have a day off, and how those things are different in and of themselves as well. So to truly Sabbath, we have to stop and rest. One of the things that I love about the element of Sabbath is it is essential to the story of creation. It's one of the very first things that we read about in the creation story in the book of Genesis. In Genesis 2, verses 1 through 3, this is what the text says. Thus the heavens and the earth were finished, and all the host of them. And on the seventh day, God finished his work that he had done, and he rested on the seventh day from all his work that he had done. So God blessed the seventh day and made it holy, because on it God rested from all his work that he had done in creation. So what it's saying here is that after 6 days of working really hard, God was really tired. No, I'm kidding, right? That's an infinite God is not going... That wasn't funny, I guess. An infinite God is not going to be tired, right? God doesn't get tired. He's not physical, he's spiritual, he's all powerful, all knowing. And so why in the world would God rest? Why would God cease and stop creating and working and rest? Well, perhaps he's doing that because he's trying to teach his creation something. He's trying to teach Adam and Eve, who was his first humans to be created, and then every single person that reads this, that hears this story, that there's a rhythm and rhyme to things. There's a way in which we're supposed to go about our lives. So when we think about this in Genesis, and we're going to look in some other parts in other scriptures as well, we've got to kind of understand, what does it mean? What does Sabbath mean? Because if you noticed, that word's not in this passage, right? That word Sabbath is not in Genesis 2, 1 through 3. It is in other passages. But the reason the word Sabbath comes about is because of the word rest. Because of the word God resting from all of his creation. And so the word Sabbath literally means the cessation of creative activity. To stop working. That's what it means. There's really nothing super spiritual or special just in the idea and definition of the word. It simply means to stop, to cease working. And as you read, if you go back and you read in Genesis 1 and you even see in Genesis 2, there's something that's really important to the creation narrative that God gives us in this passage. And it's this idea of rhythm. God built a rhythm within creation, right? 6 days of work, 1 day of rest. 6 days of work, 1 day of rest. 6 days of work, 1 day of rest, and so on and so forth. And one of the things that ultimately God is trying to demonstrate to his first creation, but also to us, is this reality that he is infinite and we are finite. And that's not a bad thing in and of itself. Like a lot of times I think we confuse sin with being finite. Sin is bad. The first creation, the first humans were not created with sin. They were created finite. And so part of being human is not being God, not being infinite, but being finite. And so there's this creation of rhythm and this working and resting to demonstrate, listen, you're finite, you're not going to be able to go 7 days a week, or you shouldn't be able to go 7 days a week. Sooner or later, that's going to catch up with you. So as we think about resting, this is the first question that I want us to think about. Why should we stop and rest? Why should we stop and rest? Again, this isn't rocket science, but it's the reminder that I think each and every one of us needs in life. Why should we stop and rest? Number one, you're not the creator. You're not the creator. In Genesis 2, verses 1 through 3, God is the one who has created all things. None of the humans have done that. We have not done that. God is the one that created all things. Number two, God is the one, as the creator, that set up the pattern to work 6 days and rest on the seventh. I mean, God could have done this. God could have worked for 7 days and then went about saying, listen, I'm God, you're not. I can work 7 days and not get tired. You need to have 6 days off and take a day of rest. But instead, God demonstrated as creator that you and I, that we should work for 6 days and rest on the seventh. So he didn't need to rest. He chose to rest to show us that we must rest. And then as creator, God created the rhythm that we just talked about, the rhythm of 6 days of work, 1 day of rest. So this idea of resting is not our idea. It's God's idea. It's God's idea that we need to rest. He could have created us differently. He could have created us where we only need to sleep one day a week. Some of you would love that. Some of you, my wife would hate that because she likes to sleep 8 to 10 hours a day. This is going to be online, right? Good. So Genesis 2, 1 through 3, you're not the creator. At the end of the day, that should humble us to recognize that God has instilled some of these things that help us understand how we should be living our lives. And I think one of the challenges that I'm going to share in just a minute that we come to often in our life is we don't rest because we think we can't rest. But if you remind yourself you're not the one that's keeping the world spinning on its axis at just the right enough speed. You're not the one that's having the earth move around the sun at just enough speed. You're not the one making sure the earth is on its axis at a particular angle, at just the right angle. God is. And the reason is because you're not the creator, God is the creator. The other passage that I want us to look at briefly is Exodus 20. In Exodus 20, this is when God gives the 10 Commandments to Moses to give to the people of Israel. Exodus 20, starting in verse 8. This is what God says to Moses. Remember the Sabbath day. So here we've went from in Genesis 2, the day of rest, to now it's called the Sabbath day. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all of your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, you or your son or your daughter, your male servant or your female servant, or your livestock, or the sojourner who is within your gates. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea, and all that is in them, and rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. So again, we come back to the reason that God is commanding the people of Israel to rest on the seventh day goes back to who God is. That God is the creator. God is referring back to Genesis 2. That God is the one that created. God is the one that set this rhythm in place. God is the one that said, you need to rest. But there's something that's interesting about this passage that I think kind of changes and probably gives even more priority to it. Number one, it's part of the Ten Commandments. And so that's a big deal, right? That these are the 10 things, the most important things that God is telling the people of Israel to do. And it's not like they're tiered, right? It's not like, okay, if you do this, this is really bad. So, I mean, it's in the list with murder. Now, what we do is we tier it, right? So, I mean, if you murder, I mean, that's really bad. If you don't practice Sabbath, well, I mean, that's not too bad. What God is saying is, no, this list is definitive. And then what he says is really important. He says things like, remember the Sabbath. He says things like, on it you shall not, or before that, the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. At the end, he says, keep it holy. So in Genesis 2, it goes from this day of physically resting, right, to in Exodus 20, something a little bit more. That yes, in Genesis, we're called to work 6 days, rest on the seventh, but here in Exodus, the emphasis shifts. Yes, still because God is creator, but now, because God is creator, on this day that you rest, you're to devote that day to the Lord. You're supposed to use that day to honor the Lord, to be with the Lord. And so there's this emphasis, this shift in emphasis from just physically resting to devoting this day to the Lord. How do we devote that day to the Lord? He talks about making it holy. So anything that's holy is what? Set apart, right? So there's something special about this day. There's something that's unique about this day that causes it to be set apart. I also think it's very important for us to recognize when we look at the people of Israel, there really wasn't anybody around the people of Israel that were practicing this kind of thing, that were actually practicing the Sabbath, making the Sabbath holy to any of their gods. So just think about that. God is calling them to do something radically different from the rest of the cultures around them. This one day is to be holy to the Lord. So why should you stop and rest? Well, number one, you're not the creator. Number two, you're not the redeemer. You're not the redeemer. If you look in Deuteronomy, you can turn there, Deuteronomy 5. It's interesting because Deuteronomy 5 is a rehashing of the Ten Commandments, but some of the language in Deuteronomy 5 changes. So look at Deuteronomy 5, verses 12 through 15. Observe the Sabbath day to keep it holy, as the Lord your God commanded you. 6 days you shall labor and do all of your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. So most of that language is pretty much the same. On it you shall not do any work, you and your son, your daughter, your male servant, your female servant, or your ox, or your donkey, or any of your livestock, or the sojourner who's within your gates, that your male servant and your female servant may rest as well as you. All of that, pretty familiar. Exodus 20 sounds very similar. Look at verse 15. You shall remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and the Lord your God brought you out from there with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. Therefore, the Lord your God commanded you to keep the Sabbath day. So all of a sudden, there's a shift. Yes, there was this in Genesis 2 and in Exodus 20. There's this reminder that we keep the Sabbath because God's the creator. Deuteronomy 5 reminds us we keep the Sabbath because God has redeemed us. The people of Israel were enslaved for 400 years. You think they had a day off? I don't think so. They were enslaved for 400 years. They worked tirelessly every day of their life. And what God is reminding them now is, listen, you're about to go into the promised land. Now you are to set aside. You're going to go back to the way creation was set up. 6 days of work, 1 day of rest. And you're honoring that day. You're devoting that day. You're remembering that day for the Lord because, not just because he's the creator, but because he's redeemed you out of slavery. So for us, that's an important reminder that for us as well, the Sabbath is a day of rest because of our redemption, of our spiritual slavery from sin that we have been bought out of and brought out of by God through Jesus Christ. Look at Hebrews 4. In Hebrews 4, there's something really interesting that the writer of Hebrews does in verses 1 through 5. He uses kind of as a comparison and analogy of the people of Israel going into the promised land and finding rest with finding rest in Christ. So in verse 1 it says this, "Therefore, while the promise of entering his rest still stands, let us fear lest any of you should seem to have failed to reach it. For good news came to us just as to them, but the message they heard did not benefit them because they were not united by faith with those who listened. For we who have believed enter that rest, as he has said, as I swore in my wrath, they shall not enter my rest, although his works were finished from the foundation of the world. For he has somewhere spoken of the seventh day in this way. And God rested on the seventh day from all his works. And again, in this passage, he said, they shall not enter my rest." So what he's talking about there, again, is the people of Israel refusing to go into the promised land and enter rest because they lack faith to believe that God will help them get the land and live peaceably in the land. But what he's referring to here is he's challenging and encouraging these Christians who are reading this letter to not fall away from their faith. And the interesting thing that he says in verse 3, "For we who have believed enter that rest." So what he's saying is the rest that was discussed and talked about in Deuteronomy and Joshua was foreshadowing the coming of Jesus. And there's this rest that now, because we are in Christ, we have a rest that we are eternally in, that we already get to experience. Not a physical rest, but a spiritual rest. See, we can rest because God is our Redeemer. You know, if you think about people that are lost, right, that don't know Christ, emotionally and spiritually, they're not restful. They're actually, probably some of them are constantly worried, fearing for their soul. What happens when I die? With those kinds of questions. And you and I can have the ultimate rest in Christ, knowing that we are in him. So we need to rest. We need to stop and rest because we're not the creator and we're not the redeemer. God is the one who has created all things. God is the one who has redeemed us. And therefore, we do what he says. Why do we do what he says? Why should we stop and rest? Well, it's just like a parent. My son and daughter want to do things that are not good for them. They think it would be fun, right, to go play out in the street or, do those kinds of things. I tell them no because I know what's best for them. God tells us to stop and rest, to Sabbath, because he knows what's best for us. So that's kind of the theological element, the biblical element that I think should undergird everything that we believe regarding Sabbath and resting. Now I want to give you some kind of practical steps. How can we stop and rest? How can we stop and rest? Number one, work hard. Work hard. You can't stop and rest if you're lazy. Because if you're lazy, you're never going to be done working. And so there's this reality that you need to do everything you can to work hard. I think I said it at some point, maybe in a staff chapel, that you should come home tired. You should go to bed tired. Because you should have worked hard during the day. So how can we stop and rest? We need to work hard. Number two, and this might be one of the more difficult ones for us, we need to create rhythm. We need to create rhythm. Just like we said at the very beginning, there's a reason that God created for 6 days and rested on the seventh. There's a reason again and again and again he goes back to work 6 days, rest on the seventh. And that rhythm needs to be a regular part of our lives. So we need to do whatever we can to create some form of rhythm where we are looking forward to our day of rest, where we're looking forward to that moment or that time where we get to rest. And so I think one of the practical consequences of this is to try as best as you can to not change your Sabbath day. As best you can, try to keep, these are the days that I'm working every week, this is the day that I'm resting. As best we can to create that rhythm. Number 3, how can we stop and rest? Plan well. If you're going to rest well, you have to plan well. The Jews they still do this. They plan to rest, right? The Jewish Sabbath is from Friday night sundown to Saturday night sundown. And because of their strict observance of the Sabbath, there's things that they can't do on the Sabbath day. And so any sort of meal preparation that they need to do to be able to eat during the Sabbath has to happen before the sun goes down on Friday night. So that requires preparation, right? That requires work for them to be able to do to plan to rest well. And so if we're going to stop and rest and Sabbath well, what that means is we're going to have to plan that as well. What sort of events? Like if Saturday is your day of rest, something's always coming up, right? There's always something on Saturday. There's a party, there's this, there's that, or there's a meal that needs to be made, or the kids have this, or they have that. So you've got to figure out, what are you going to do? How are you going to plan this well? So you've got to plan well. Number 4, how can we stop and rest? You have to rest physically. So what that means is you got to stop work. You got to stop doing things that you would consider work, whether you get paid for it or not. So let's say you're remodeling your house, and that's work. You probably shouldn't do that on your Sabbath day. You need to rest physically. That's part of what is in that creation mandate in Genesis 2. 6 days of work, 7th day of rest. How can we stop and rest? We also need to enjoy life. The Sabbath should not be something that is weighty or feels like a burden, but it should be something that you actually enjoy. That's what Sean is going to talk about next Staff Chapel when we look at delighting. What are things in your life that you need to include in the Sabbath that will help you enjoy life? So for me, reading, napping, watching a good movie, spending time with my kids, my wife, napping again, going to bed. Those kinds of things. What are things in your life that you enjoy? Maybe you like to fish. Maybe you like to go for a walk. Maybe you like to enjoy nature. Like whatever those things are, what are those things that you like to do? And try and include those in your day of rest. Next, what can we do? What do we need to do to stop and rest? We need to worship God. And I think this is probably one of the most important ones, because what we've got to be careful is what God is not commanding and challenging us and encouraging us to do is have a day off. What God's encouraging, challenging, and commanding us to do is to remember the Sabbath and to keep it holy, make it holy, devote it to the Lord. And so just taking a day off where you've done nothing but binge watch Netflix is not Sabbathing. All you've done is just not worked. And so to Sabbath is to use part of that day to worship the Lord. So whether that is, Bible reading, an extended time of prayer, family devotions with your family, maybe singing songs with your family, whatever that is important for you, maybe listening to sermons, whatever it is, what are you doing on that day to set it apart to worship the Lord on that day? So that's another thing. How can we stop and rest? Give grace. And what I mean by this is give yourself some grace. If you are terrible at or never have done, try to Sabbath, you're going to screw it up. Something's not going to go right. Or you're going to be in the middle of your Sabbath and your kid throws up. And then it's just like, well, this sucks. This isn't a Sabbath anymore. Or whatever that is. And so especially in the very beginning, like you've got to give yourself grace. And one of the most important elements about this is if you make this day a burden for you or anybody else that's keeping this day with you, then it's not going to refresh you. Remember, part of the point of the Sabbath is that it would be physically refreshing, that it would be spiritually refreshing, that it would be emotionally refreshing. And so if you don't give yourself some grace in that, it's going to become a burden that weighs you down. And if you're like me, you might be a legalist, and then it's a burden, but you think you have to keep doing it, and then it becomes a burden for a very long time. And then you never want to Sabbath again, even though you need to and it's important. And the last thing is this: trust God. Trust God. When you feel like you can't rest, trust God. When you feel like you can't rest, trust God. Why? You're not the creator. You're not the redeemer. So part of us stopping is simply remembering that we're not God. And so Sabbathing for us, the important element of it is simply taking time to say, listen, I've got to stop. Because part of my stopping is saying, God, I trust you with whatever it is. If it's financial, if it's time, it's saying, I trust you. You can get this. You can do what I can't do, right? It's that thing that people say, like, God can do more with 90% of my money than I can with 100% of my money. And I think the same thing is true with our Sabbath. God can do more with 6 days of our life, productivity, goals, execution, all of that, than we can with 7 days of our life. So, how can we stop and rest? Work hard, create rhythm, plan well, rest physically, enjoy life, worship God, give grace, and trust God. I want to close doing a couple things. You've got questions there at the end of the sheet, and I really want to take the next 10 minutes for us as a group to kind of process these questions. And the goal of these questions, because how many of you would say you're killing Sabbath right now? That's what I thought. How many of you would say, I have a Sabbath, but I'm not great at it? So like 3.5? Was there a half? There's a half there. So I think these questions are going to help you at least take next steps in building a Sabbath. Because here's the reality. You're all married or soon to be married. And what that means is, and if you have kids at the same time, what that means is you can't plan a Sabbath and say, this is what I'm doing, when you've not incorporated your family into it. And just another thing that I could have put in here that I didn't is, just like the rule of life we talked about last week, with seasons of life, your Sabbath looks different. And so, for some of you, when you have kids, it's going to look a little different, and you got to figure that out. So, number one, what's your greatest hindrance to practicing a Sabbath? What's your greatest hindrance to practicing a Sabbath? And I want you to think about that holistically. Some of you, it might be spiritual. You could honestly say to yourself, I don't think I trust God enough. And what I've got to work through is actually saying, God, I trust you. Some of you might be, this is more me than anything, is like, listen, I just haven't taken the time to sit down with Rachel and say, what do you think we should do for our Sabbath? So it's beginning to think maybe it's spiritual, maybe it's very practical. What is that? Number two, make an initial list of things you want to include in your Sabbath and things you want to exclude. And so begin to brainstorm. Like, these are things that I know fill me up, refresh me, allow me to rest. These are other things? Absolutely not. I cannot do them. Something I would encourage you to consider is not shopping on Saturday. or whatever day, whatever your Sabbath is, whatever that day is. Consider not buying goods on that day. That's something you exclude. Number 3, what's a good first step for you to begin to implement a regular Sabbath in your life? So I'm not telling you to plan it all out. What's one thing that you would say, this is the next step I need to take that will help me begin to Sabbath better? I also want to encourage you, we'll talk about it more, but last week when we looked at some of the goal setting and stuff that we talked about, one of the things that we didn't talk about last week that was at the end of your packet are these 2 sheets, the Weekend Optimizer and the Full Focus Planner. And I think these 2 sheets would really help you begin to think about planning and at least lay some groundwork in regards to what your Sabbath should look like. So he puts on here things like how much sleep do you want to get? Do you also want a nap? What strategies will you employ to ensure you get the rest you desire? There's a reflection section. How do you want to spend time this weekend reflecting on what matters most? So there you can talk about Bible reading, worship, family. Relationships, list 3 to 5 key relationships. What does quality time with them look like? So the other thing that's important about Sabbath is I think it's communal. This doesn't mean you shut your home and say, no one's coming in. It's just us today. No, it's okay to invite friends over and spend time with them in that.